Okay, for your lecture over schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, I really want to focus on the biological etiologies, and I want you to go way back to when we talked about models of etiology in chapter 2, and we looked at psychological and biological etiologies, because schizophrenia is a disorder that actually shows all 5 different models of biological etiology, and they all kind of work together. So I want us to think about those different models, and we're going to kind of map them out here. So when we think about etiology, again, remember etiology means cause, we find that there is some genetic heritage involved in schizophrenia, and so this is of course behavioral genetics. What this means is that if you have a family member who has schizophrenia, you have an increased risk than the general population of getting schizophrenia. And the closer that family member is to you, the higher your risk. So it's something like if you have a parent, it's 15%. If you have 2 parents, it's 50%. So the more relatives you have and the closer that relative is, the more risk that you have. Second, they've been doing a lot of gene mapping associated with schizophrenia. So there's all sorts of research out there that says, you know, we've identified this gene that's linked. We've identified this one over here. We've identified this one over here. There's actually something like over 100 separate genes that have some support that they link to schizophrenia. What that actually means is there probably isn't just one gene. It's probably some sort of combination, and there's probably some sort of environmental components that are part of it. But remember, way back in chapter 2, this was called molecular genetics. Excuse me here. Molecular genetics, where we actually try to find the actual gene associated with it. And then for most disorders, we've seen some neurotransmitter connections, and so we had sort of a neurotransmitter model. And for schizophrenia, it's no different. The major neurotransmitter implicated in schizophrenia is dopamine. So it's what's called the dopamine hypothesis. This has actually gotten more complicated over the years. They used to believe that there was just an excess of dopamine, too much dopamine in the system. But what they found is that that is actually associated with the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, hallucinations, delusions, disordered speech. However, there is a category of symptoms called negative symptoms, and that is linked to too little dopamine within a system. So there's actually 2 different pathways. The first pathway is called mesolimbic, and that is associated with the positive. So I'll put that up here. Mesolimbic system. That's associated with positive symptoms, and that's too much dopamine. Then there is the mesocortical, and that's actually part of the frontal lobe here, and that's associated with negative symptoms and too little dopamine. So the dopamine hypothesis is complicated. In some parts of the brain you have too much, in some parts of the brain you have too little. So medication for schizophrenia can be difficult. Next we can look at the morphological etiology. Remember, morphology means structure. So we see in individuals with schizophrenia, they have enlarged ventricles. Ventricles are the fluid pockets in your brain, and because they have bigger fluid pockets, they have less gray matter. So bigger lakes, less land, essentially. And so that could be associated with some of the cognitive deficits that we often see with schizophrenia. So we have a structural change. We don't know what came first, the structural change or the disorder, so keep that in mind. And then we do finally have a functional etiology, and this has to do with what's called pruning. So your brain actually gets rid of neurological connections that it's not using. So this is the reason that the game show Are You Smarter Than a 5th Grader was popular. You learn stuff in elementary school, and unless you use it on a regular basis, you prune it or you lose it. So during adolescence, early adolescence, we do a lot of pruning. What they have found is that individuals who later develop schizophrenia prune more and longer than other individuals. So maybe there's something associated with them getting rid of neurological connections that they shouldn't get rid of because they're doing too much pruning. They're cutting the bush too much, and they actually end up killing off some of those components. That's just sort of the metaphor there. So we have all 5 biological etiological models are exhibited in schizophrenia. What likely happens is that there's a combination of them. So there's some sort of risk factor involved in your genes, and then something happens environmentally that sort of turns those genes on, and then it starts messing with how your brain is structured and how your brain actually functions. So they all sort of work together to eventually create this disorder that we call schizophrenia.